Hello, folks. Welcome to this new edition of Tomaskycast. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and I am joined, as you can see, by Mallory McMorrow, state senator from the state of Michigan, whom you all saw on your televisions. What was it, about 6 weeks ago, I think it was. We'll talk about that viral incident that made her nationally famous, but we'll talk also about what she does aside from that, and about politics in the state of Michigan, which are always fascinating and obviously very important to where the country goes. State Senator, hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's start right in on the event. This was late April, right?
Yeah, mid-April, mid to late April, yeah.
Okay, and so how did this start? There's a Republican state senator named Lana Theis who did something. Why don't you tell folks what happened?
Yeah, so I woke up on a Monday morning and got a text from my husband who had seen a screenshot of an email. I think it was floating around on Twitter. But Senator Theis, a Republican from a different area of the state, we are not running against each other or anything like that, but a colleague of mine sent out a fundraising email for herself, accusing me by name of wanting to groom and sexualize kindergartners and wanting 8-year-olds to believe that they were responsible for slavery. And I was gobsmacked. I mean, I think my jaw hit the floor, and I had reporters calling me fairly quickly to get some comment. And I tried really hard throughout the day not to comment on it or think about it and go about my day. I wanted to make sure that I could take the meetings that I had with constituents. But I just sat in how awful I felt for an entire day. And I was giving my daughter a bath that night, and her name is Noah. She's almost 1.5 now.
Oh, wow.
And she, she's oblivious.
Where do you live?
In Royal Oak, Michigan.
Okay.
And, she's oblivious to everything. She's just learning about the world. She has no idea what I do or what happened that day. And I just remember she started just laughing hysterically, and I started crying. And I had talked to my mom, and my mom asked me, how can you still keep doing this job if people just are comfortable saying things about you that have no basis in reality? Friends of mine who moved from Michigan, or moved from DC to Michigan, who were regulars at Comet Ping Pong, they think about this language, and they called me to ask if I was okay and if they needed to come over, because this is the type of language that encourages certain people to head over and start shooting if they think that there are children under attack. So it was a really hard day, and I stayed up all night just writing a lot of things down. And I initially had started out by calling out a lot of the hypocrisy on the Republican side of the aisle. And we had a Speaker of the House here named Lee Chatfield, who was recently accused of actual grooming and raping his sister-in-law when she was 15. So I started including language about that. And eventually I deleted all of that and wanted to focus on reclaiming my own identity, but hoping to give a public response that would get out of the usual Democrats versus Republicans just throwing mud at each other. So I didn't mention, Democrats or Republicans in the speech at all. And I recognize that however bad I felt for one day is how bad it feels every day if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, if you are the parent of a trans child, which is a constituent of mine who I've talked to frequently over the past couple of years, or if you are a Black resident who has seen, all of the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and not only has seen no reaction, but now sees fear mongering around critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion. I mean, so that's really where I got to what I got to. And I have a 90-minute commute from my house to Lansing. So I repeated a lot of what I wrote over and over to myself until I got to something that I felt good with. And I gave that speech on the Senate floor, and now many millions of people have watched it. And here we are a little over a month later.
Did you share it with any colleagues beforehand, or just went up and gave it?
I just went up and gave it. I'd called Jeremy Moss, who's a colleague of mine, who's our only openly gay senator, because especially knowing the attacks on the LGBTQ community and knowing that it really wasn't an attack against me, all things considered, I am fine. I'm not a member of a marginalized community. And this felt like a warning shot to come after me for daring to stand up with some of quote unquote those people. So I called him the night before, and I wanted to make sure that if I was stepping into this space, I was doing it in a way that respected and acknowledged that it wasn't really my issue. But it is, because it is, and I said in the speech, hate only wins when people like me stand back and let it happen. So that I hadn't showed it to anybody else. I texted my husband, who was actually out of the country. He was in Germany. And I said, oh, I think this one's going to be a doozy. But that was it. Yeah. I wrote it, I gave it, and everybody heard it for the first time.
Were you surprised at all by the eruption of reaction?
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, it's such a bizarre question for people to ask me. I'm a state senator in Michigan. Nobody ever expects that a speech you give on the state legislature, Senate floor, is going to get retweeted by Hillary Clinton, and you get a phone call from the president, and James Carville and the guys who run Pod Save America dissected it line by line, and it's been overwhelming, but overwhelmingly positive, because I think I was gearing myself up for really negative feedback, and we just haven't gotten any.
Wow, that's great. So what have you, how have you tried to use now your newfound notoriety?
So well before this speech, I feel like I've sort of been screaming into the ether, especially from Michigan, that we're in this mess because the Republican Party has understood for decades that you work from the bottom up and you run candidates in state legislatures. And, we're at where we're at with Roe about to fall because of all these horrible laws that are passing from state legislatures all around the country. So in the wake of the speech and the impact of it, it's a bizarre experience to have people reach out and ask when you're running for higher office, or do you have plans to run for president? And I'm saying absolutely not. My singular focus is flipping the Michigan State Senate to Democratic control for the first time since 1984. Yeah. So that is what we've been doing. So I've been doing a lot of events in the state, out of state, to try to rile up some donors and make the pitch that this is a much higher return on investment. And it's no hyperbole to say that if we don't do this in Michigan, this may be the very last free and fair election we ever have. So I feel like it's the most important thing I could possibly be doing.
Yeah. She has not apologized to you or spoken to you since.
No. And that really wasn't the point. People ask me, why haven't you filed a libel lawsuit, and do you want an apology from her? I'm like, honestly, no. I want these attacks to stop. And that's way more important than if I get an apology or not.
Yeah. So tell folks more about yourself, about, you ran first for the state senate in 2018. So you're fairly new to politics. So tell folks, where you come from, how you got interested in politics, and what your top issues and passions are.
Sure. Yeah. I never thought I would be in this position. I've lived in 5 different states. So I was actually born and raised in New Jersey. I went to school at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Lived out in California and New York for a little while. I was a car designer, and I worked at Mattel. I designed Hot Wheels products and oversaw global branding and licensing creative for Hot Wheels. So 4-year-olds think I'm super cool. But we moved back to Michigan. My husband's originally from Michigan, and we saw, 2014 turn into 2015, turn into 2016. And the 2016 presidential election happened. And I just remember I think we ordered like wings and beer, and we had one friend over to watch the returns come in, who's a friend of ours, who's a Republican, but like a moderate Republican. And the attitude was like, okay, we're going to watch our long national nightmare become over because we're not going to elect this crazy guy to be president. And then the night went on and got later and later. And I had friends from around the country like texting me that it was going to come down to Michigan, and there was going to be this beautiful story that like Detroit saves the country. But that didn't happen. And I just remember waking up the next day being devastated and looking around my community, which Royal Oak is fairly democratic, and seeing people hanging Trump flags. And there was a willingness to look the other way at hatred and fear mongering and misogyny and sexual assault for the promise that we could go back to a time when America was great, which is something that really resonates in a state that manufactures cars. We are still recovering from the last recession, and that really hurt me. And then there was a video that went viral of middle school students chanting "Build that wall" at a Latina student. And that video came from Royal Oak Middle School, which was my polling place.
Oh, wow.
So that
Jeez.
broke something in me.
Yeah.
And I Googled how to run for office. And I went to the Women's March in Detroit and exchanged phone numbers with people and started hosting, phone banking parties at my house to call our legislators, and went through a program from Emerge America, which recruits and trains Democratic women to run for office. Mm-hmm. And then I filed to run. So we took on a Republican incumbent in a Republican district. And my husband, a few months in, convinced me to put my consultancy on hold and do it full time, which was terrifying to me because I haven't not had an income since I was 12. And we built up a campaign of more than 500 volunteers and a ton of retired teachers and grandparents and kids. And it was really moving. And I loved the process of campaigning, and we won. So I've now been in the job for 4 years, up for re-election next year. But it really, I've been really adamant for the past 4 years that it was this hate and othering that pushed me to run in the first place. And 4 years later, it hasn't gone anywhere, and it's getting worse.
And how's your new district? Has it changed much?
Yeah. So with redistricting, Michigan approved an independent citizens redistricting commission in 2018. So for the first time, it was drawn by real people, not the legislature. I am going from what was about a 47% Democratic district to a 78% Democratic district. That includes, which I'm really excited about, both the suburbs in Oakland County and a significant portion of the city of Detroit, which is, frankly, I think long overdue, so that we can stop kind of this silos of the city versus the suburbs and actually do some work that benefits everybody, which is exciting.
So it sounds like this commission, which I don't know anything about, to be honest with you, but it sounds like they've actually done their job in a good, competent way. Is that correct?
Yeah, Michigan currently, and it's not perfect. I think that there are a lot of districts, and mine is one of them, in the Metro Detroit area, where, because a lot of the districts are crossing over 8 Mile, which is the dividing line between the city and the suburbs, that there is a likelihood that there will be fewer Black legislators that represent the city. And I'm keenly aware of that. Yeah. But on the whole, the number one requirement for the commission was partisan fairness on a statewide basis. Mm-hmm. And the Princeton gerrymandering project and many others are kind of holding up Michigan as the gold standard right now. Yeah. For, hopefully, we're actually going to have a fair election for the first time in my lifetime.
Wow. Now, your antagonist, your attacker, has a primary, and she's being primaried from her right. Tell people a little bit about that race, please.
Yeah. And this was, kind of going back, some people have been asking me, like, why did she come after you? And I still struggle to figure it out, because she and I wouldn't say we were friends, but we were friendly. I drove to her district one day. I got coffee. She had talked about her husband and my husband going out to dinner at one point. So it kind of came out of nowhere. Wow. But I do know she is being primaried from the right by somebody who had previously tried to challenge Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, pulled out of that primary. But somebody who has been at many of the big lie rallies, who's made appearances with the Proud Boys. And I don't know if it's political pressure or if she fundamentally believes some of these things, but it has gotten to a point where we have to put an end to people being able to say whatever they want about other people with no consequences. And I think that Democrats, for probably too long, I think we've sort of operated under this idea that, well, if we just ignore bullies, they'll go away. they're not going away. They're getting louder and more powerful, and they're not going to go away unless we stop them.
Let's talk more about Michigan politics. So your governor, Gretchen Whitmer, of course, was a target of a plot against her. Yeah. Its politics are very contentious in your state. She's up for re-election. Your Dana Nessel is Attorney General or Secretary of State?
Attorney General Nessel.
Yeah. Also up for re-election. These are very important posts in a state that's going to be very crucial in 2024. They've also both been very outspoken about how they'll deal with the aftermath of a possible overturning of Roe. So talk in turn about both of those, Whitmer and Nessel, and where they stand with the electorate in Michigan and so forth.
Yeah, so something that every time I'm talking to somebody not from Michigan about Michigan is you have to understand that this state is the entire spectrum. We are everything all at once. And if you want to take a pulse on how the country is doing, just check in on Michigan. Yeah. Because we are a state that elected Gretchen Whitmer, Dana Nessel, and Jocelyn Benson, our Secretary of State, in 2018, all women. Dana Nessel was an openly gay attorney general who fought for marriage equality in the states, who has flat out said, as you alluded to, that she will not prosecute once Roe falls and our devastating 1931 abortion law goes into effect. Right. So we're a state that does that. And on the other end, we're a state that has more homegrown extremist and militia activity, I think, than any other state in the country. A lot of people don't realize. So Timothy McVeigh used to attend Michigan militia meetings before carrying out, the largest domestic terrorist attack we had ever seen. So it is encouraging, and it's helpful for me to have so many women that I can talk to, relate to, because the attacks on women in Michigan, it's not about our political positions, they're personal threats. Mm-hmm. It was the attack to kidnap and potentially kill the governor. And I think that court case, if I'm honest, went the wrong way. And sets a really dangerous precedent where just because they didn't succeed doesn't mean they didn't try. Yeah. I tried to sound the alarm. We had a protest here in Michigan on April 30th of 2020 that was ostensibly about COVID restrictions, but we saw nooses, swastikas, Confederate flags, Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys.
This was the thing at the Capitol building.
This was at our state capitol, and they came into the Capitol. They came into our Senate chamber. So there was a photo that went viral of 4 men, with AR-15s and kind of full paramilitary tactical gear on. And what you don't see in that photo is directly under them is me, because we were on the Senate floor. And what separates our Capitol from January 6th is they didn't break into our Capitol. The Senate Majority Leader, Republican Mike Shirkey, invited them in and took a meeting with them in our gallery and told reporters that they weren't allowed to listen because it was a private meeting. And then I just remember we learned about the FBI case against those who tried to kidnap the governor. Watching it while I was on the Senate floor, we were streaming it on our laptops, and the same Senate Majority Leader stood up during session, and he said that these were thugs and this is not how you express your frustrations with your government. But then at the same time, he immediately left session and went to a rally on our Capitol steps with the same group that organized this attack. And it is this willingness of this current GOP to kind of wink and nod at extremists that puts us in a really dangerous situation. So, I think a lot of people by now have seen the speech that I gave. And as it was starting to get views in the same week that my speech was taking off and it was getting all this national attention, the state GOP held their annual nominating convention for Secretary of State, Attorney General, and they nominated a woman named Christina Caramo for Secretary of State and Matt DePerno for Attorney General, both of whom are far-right conspiracy theorist, Trump-backed lunatics versus, a crowded field of well-known, well-resourced, kind of traditional and even conservative Republicans. And Christina Caramo has said that the LGBTQ community goes against God's design, that yoga is a satanic ritual. She, touting all of these election fraud claims and claiming that her vote never counted, even though she's never offered up evidence to prove that. And Matt DePerno, has basically made a name for himself grifting off of the big lie, fundraising aggressively, going down to Mar-a-Lago. He was fired from his own law firm for padding, client billings. But this is who they're falling in line with. And that's the scariest thing for me, is that the current party, instead of rebuking them, is falling in line. And that's why I think, those of us in Michigan, we can't assume that this nonsense is just going to take care of itself. It's not. And it's going to take Democrats, frankly, traditional Republicans, anybody who fundamentally believes in this country and elections and things working, getting together and saying, this is not where we're going.
What's the margin of their majority in the state Senate?
4 seats. So there are 38 state senators, 16 Democrats. So we need 4 for majority.
You got a shot?
Absolutely. Yeah. We feel good. There's about 7 races that we feel competitive in now. And if we have a standard election year, all projections show kind of a 19-19 tie. But if we get aggressive and we get out there, and I know we can, because we've been doing that for 40 years and picking up seats like mine that we shouldn't have gotten, we can and should get to a majority.
And what's the lower house split?
It's now 3. So there was a special election in the west side of the state a few weeks ago for a House seat in a Trump plus 14 district, and a Democrat, Carol Glanville, won by calling out, this was the guy who was running on the Republican side was a monster. He was anti-Semitic, said that the invasion of Ukraine was led by Anthony Fauci because of a bioweapon, and also has said on record that if his daughters were ever raped, that he would tell them to lie back and enjoy it. And even most Republican strategists say with those margins, she still never should have won. Like, even the worst Republican candidate should have carried that district. But she told people, she's like, this is not who we are. And she worked hard. She got out a door. She talked to neighbors, and she said, this isn't it, but I have another alternative. So we need 4 in the Senate and 3 in the House.
Wow. And if you did that and Whitmer won re-election, then things would be looking up legislatively and in terms of 2024, I assume, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of people look at Governor Whitmer and some of the people at the top in Michigan and assume we're a blue state. We're a very purple state, and we always have been. But actually having a legislature that could work with the governor for the first time really in 40 years would mean we would get to show some of our priorities. So a good example is on reproductive rights. Michigan has a 1931 law currently on the books that will go into effect immediately once Roe falls, that says that abortion under all circumstances is a felony with a minimum of 4 years in prison, with no exception for rape, incest, age. And it was actually written in 1847. So you can imagine it's pretty vague. So it also includes language about medication abortion, which could be interpreted for self-managed abortion, and contraception. So overnight, Michigan will become the most extreme state in the country. But if we've got a legislative majority that can work with the governor, we can be proactive like other states and codify access into law in statute so that we are not dependent on the US Supreme Court to protect us. And I'm the primary bill sponsor of the Reproductive Health Act in the Senate to do just that. And that's just one issue of many of the others that we'd be able to actually govern on instead of just messaging on.
I know we need to wrap up, but let me close with this, referring back to your famous speech, powerful speech, and just reflecting on some of the things you've mentioned, some of these candidates that you've just discussed.
Yeah.
On the other side. What do you think happened to the Republican Party? I mean, this predates Donald Trump. I mean, he made it worse, but what has happened from as a Michigander, just watching the party nominate these people? What has happened?
I think that fear is a very powerful motivator. And if you look back at Rush Limbaugh and kind of the start of right-wing AM radio and being able to utilize C-SPAN to kind of talk directly to voters, recognizing you weren't talking to the chamber. It's a lot easier to scare people than to govern. Governing is hard. The idea that we have roads here in Michigan that are in disrepair because of decades of disinvestment. It's not popular to talk about tax policy and come up with real long-term revenue solutions. So that's a lot of what I tried to point to in my speech is if you are the parent of a trans child or not, they're lying to you. Your healthcare costs being too high is not because a trans fifth grader wants to play soccer. And it is just, it's the lowest common denominator. And when you add on how badly gerrymandered Michigan has been, it has promoted whoever says the craziest, most awful, most vile thing. And the party's not pushing back. Michigan Republicans used to be very moderate. Governor Milliken, a Republican, was a conservationist, believed very strongly in protecting the Great Lakes. We're the Great Lakes state and was really known for that. Reproductive rights and access used to be a bipartisan issue that, a woman's right to her own body was not controversial. But I think, again, Michigan being a warning shot for the rest of the country, fear is powerful. And the only way that this continued trend of ramping up the rhetoric, ramping up the attacks, and just tapping into people's worst fears, especially as it relates to kids now. Now the Republican strategy seems to be every time your child leaves your front door, everybody is trying to hurt them and attack them without addressing the very real things that are hurting kids, like, gun violence, for example. But it's going to take losing, because right now it's working because it's a winning strategy. And the only way it ends is if we end it.
State Senator Mallory McMorrow, what a pleasure to talk to you.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thanks for your time. Keep up the fight.
Thanks.